Hi, everybody, and welcome. We are so thrilled to have you today as we welcome the author of A Campaign of Giants, The Battle for Petersburg, Volume 2, From the Crater's Aftermath to the Battle of Burgess Mill. And we'd like to thank viewers like you who make Book Breaks possible. If you want to contribute to the program, please send an email to bookbreaks@gilderlerman.org to learn more. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and my friend Ryan is getting a much-deserved day off, so we have our friend Hannah, who is a GLI curatorial intern. Do not try to say that 5 times fast. And without further ado, we are so thrilled to welcome our guest today, A. Wilson Greene, the former president of the Pamplin Historical Park and founding director of the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier. A. Wilson Greene is the author of From Crossing the James to the Crater, the first volume of A Campaign of Giants. Welcome. We are so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you, Gina. It's great to be with you.
Now, just to start us off, can you give us an overview of The Battle for Petersburg, Volume 2?
Sure. Well, this is the second of a projected 3-volume treatment of the longest Civil War campaign that occurred between 1861 and 1865. The Battle for Petersburg lasted 292 days, involved more than 78 battle-sized engagements, numerous cavalry raids, a number of smaller engagements, and witnessed the most extensive construction of fortifications ever seen on the North American continent. So it's a big story, and I've got 3 volumes to tell it. And this second volume is sort of the middle stage. It takes the story from August of 1864 through October of 1864, where the first volume started with the crossing of the James in the middle of June of 64, and then concluded with arguably the most famous of the engagements at Petersburg, the Battle of the Crater, which occurred on July 30th. And I pick up the story in volume 2 from that point.
Yeah, and one thing you kind of get a sense of in your writing is that the Battle of the Crater was really a lost opportunity for the Union. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it really was. Of course, counterfactual history is a dangerous terrain to navigate, and who knows what might have happened. But it seemed like the federal forces, the Union forces, had a chance to break through the Confederate line and occupy the commanding ground that was called Cemetery Hill. And those people who have been to Petersburg will know it as the site of Blandford Cemetery. The logistics of the Battle of the Crater worked just fine. 8,000 pounds of black powder exploded, albeit a little bit late, but it exploded at 4:44 in the morning of July 30th. It blew a gigantic crater in the earth and cleared out about 500 yards of the Confederate line. And that's 5 football fields wide of an avenue for the Union forces to have tried to take the high ground. But poor leadership by the federal commanders and a rather rapid response by the surprised Confederates led to what Grant would call the worst experience, the greatest disaster of the Civil War for him. And so there, I pick up the story from there, starting with the inevitable search for scapegoats that occurred in August, blaming the commander of the Union troops who led the assault at the crater, Ambrose Burnside.
Yeah, do you feel like Burnside was unfairly vilified?
I think he was. I'm a member of a very small fraternity of historians who consider Burnside a little bit better general than his reputation would have you believe. Burnside did everything right with the Battle of the Crater, except one thing. He had designated his only United States colored troops, African-American soldiers in his corps, to lead the attack. They had received some kind of training. Now, how much training they actually got is in doubt, but these folks were ready. They were eager to prove themselves competent soldiers. But at the 11th hour, Burnside's commander, George Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, seconded by General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant, told Burnside he could not use the black troops. Instead of naming one of his two competent white division commanders to lead the attack, he left the decision up to fate. They drew straws, and as it turned out, the worst division commander in the Army of the Potomac, a man named James Ledlie, drew the short straw to lead the attack. And Burnside is culpable for not making a decision to have one of his two more competent division commanders lead it. I think he was falsely accused by Meade and Hancock, commander of the Second Corps, of not getting his troops out in time, of not preparing avenues for the attack, which I think is spurious. And it's important to know that, when you study military history, it's like studying any organization. There are personality clashes, and there was a definite dislike of Burnside by General Meade. And so when Meade created this court of inquiry to determine who was at fault for the crater, he picked all of his hand-picked folks who also did not like Burnside. And so the result was inevitable, and Burnside's military career ended as a result of his defeat at the crater.
Yeah, can you tell us a little more about the experience of the African American soldiers there? Because that's powerful.
Yes, well, at the crater, the black soldiers, like what happened in many places during the Civil War, were subject to a massacre. There's no other word for it. The Confederate troops considered armed black men as a slave rebellion, Gina, and not as soldiers. And there's only one way to deal with a slave rebellion, and that was to put it down fatally. The Confederates were unapologetic about shooting wounded black soldiers who were trying to surrender were shot down. Prisoners were taken to the rear but never made it to a prison, obviously dispatched on their way. And one of the things about volume 2 of my trilogy is that the black soldiers, particularly on the north side of the James River, will play a central role in a number of the engagements that I deal with. In fact, I think this is the apogee of black soldiers' combat during the Civil War. And their champion was the commander of the Army of the James, a fellow named Ben Butler, who's another guy who gets, I think, a bad rep amongst historians. Certainly, he was not a great general, but he was not as bad as he's often portrayed, and he certainly was a champion of black soldiers. And by the end of this experience, Gina, many of the white soldiers in the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, who were very skeptical, if not outright hostile, towards black troops, began to have a grudging respect for these men, because they had proven their bravery and their courage, if not their experience. I don't want to exaggerate. The black soldiers weren't supermen. They weren't probably as good as experienced white soldiers, but they were brave and willing to fight. And I think that earned them a grudging respect by many of the white soldiers in the Union Army.
Yeah, and how did the press at the time report on this incident? Was it talked about much?
It was talked about a great deal. It became sort of a cause célèbre in the North. There was an earlier episode in 1864 which generated even more press. So this was that was the fight at a place called Fort Pillow along the Mississippi River in Tennessee, where black troops were again accused of being massacred by Nathan Bedford Forrest. That received a tremendous amount of publicity. And the crater was sort of a follow-up. See, this is, the Eastern press took up that call and condemned the Confederates for what they were doing. And that, I think, also boosted the reputation of African American troops. Petersburg is kind of a watershed. It's not the first use of black troops, but it's the most extensive. And of course, by the end of the war, there were 180,000 African American soldiers in the Union Army. That's a good 1/8 of every Union soldier was a black soldier, and most of them not all, but most of them were former slaves.
Absolutely. Well, and this is towards the end of the war. Can you tell us what the mindset of both armies was like at this time and how that might have affected their decision making?
I think volume two, this period between August and October, is sort of a transition period. It's appropriate that it's the middle volume because, at the beginning of this campaign, let's say back in May of 1864, Confederates were doing pretty well. They were very optimistic. By the time that August 1st rolls around, the beginning of volume two, just look at what was going on in the war. In the Shenandoah Valley, a Confederate army had reached Washington, D.C. and was ranging free throughout the Shenandoah Valley. In Georgia, a Confederate army was still holding out against General Sherman's three armies trying to capture Atlanta. The open port at Mobile, Alabama, was still functioning. An army in Arkansas was ready to move into Missouri to try to redeem that state for the Confederacy. So at the beginning of August, things are really not looking all that bad for the Confederates. By the end of October, when volume two ends, Phil Sheridan has basically destroyed the Confederate army in the Shenandoah Valley. Sherman has captured Atlanta and is about ready to march to the sea. Mobile, Alabama has been closed off as a port, leaving only one really functioning port in the Confederacy. And that army in Missouri was a fraction of itself, limping away through Kansas and Arkansas and Texas, never again to fight. So the beginning of August, I think the Confederates are feeling like things have gone well. They've won every battle around Petersburg and all the other things. By the end of October, things are starting to get a little bit different. Although we have to be careful, hindsight is 2020, and a good historian doesn't try to impose what we know onto the people who are being the subject of your writing. But still, there were cracks in the Confederate optimism that were evident by the end of October of 1864. And at this point, where I'll start out volume three, is the relationship between the soldiers in both armies and the upcoming presidential election. And that's another thing we have to remember about Civil War history. Yes, we deal with military history. That's what we talk about. That's what my book is about. But you can't divorce it from the politics. And by the end of October of 1864, many Confederates had pinned their hopes for independence on the defeat of Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election.
Yeah, and it's interesting how Lincoln sort of looms larger than Jefferson Davis in the Confederacy side.
Well, yeah, and Lincoln and Grant have a terrific relationship. Another lesson that history can teach you, military history can teach you, is if you want to be successful in an organization, get along with your boss. And Grant knew how to get along with Abraham Lincoln. And Robert E. Lee knew how to get along with Jefferson Davis. And a great deal of their success is that they were able to operate with the approval, and in Lincoln's case, with almost a hands-off treatment of how Grant was operating his campaigns. Of course, Grant was general in chief. He was responsible not only for the actions around Petersburg and Richmond, but also every place else in the Civil War. And Lincoln basically said, I don't need to know what your plans are. I trust you. Just tell me what you need. That's a little bit different than the approach that he had to take with previous commanders.
Yeah, I was going to ask about his approach with, say, Meade, General Meade.
He was very disappointed in General Meade, and I think maybe unfairly. Of course, Meade is most famous for his victory at Gettysburg in July of 1863. But Meade did not pursue Lee's army as Lee was retreating back towards Virginia with the same vigor that Lincoln believed was necessary. Now, I've written a little something about that, and I think Meade is probably justified in the way that he pursued. But Lincoln didn't see it that way, and Lincoln never really forgave Meade for that. And in fact, when Grant was appointed general in chief, Lincoln certainly would have agreed with Grant if Grant decided to fire Meade and bring in someone of his own. But Grant recognized that Meade was loyal and a good commander and retained him in command. And so Meade was inoculated a little bit from whatever malice Lincoln may have carried over from his disappointment after Gettysburg.
Yeah, well, the book is so meticulously researched and chock full of information. So I wonder if you could share with our readers some of your favorite discoveries in the letters that you used, the maps you encountered.
Well, Gina, this is, as I said, this is a massive campaign. You have more than 200,000 soldiers writing letters for 9.5 months. My bibliography is more than 450 pages of single-spaced entries. There's a lot of research here, but you find, you learn an awful lot about things that maybe escape most historians. I think the thing that I've learned the most about is soldier life, and this is something that I'm going to get into in volume 3 more than I have in volume 2 or volume 1. All the details of what it was like to be a soldier at Petersburg on a day-to-day basis. There's humorous things. There are tragic things. I don't mean to be self-deprecating, but I really have never claimed that I am breaking new ground with these books. There have been a number of very good monographs on individual aspects of this campaign. I think what I'm trying to do is put the story together between the covers of 3 books and try to use new voices to tell the story. I think the story is familiar, but maybe with the fact that I've done quite a bit of manuscript research, I'm allowing new voices to tell what happened around Petersburg and Richmond.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I also feel like it's not given usually historically as much weight as, say, Gettysburg or Antietam or even Vicksburg. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And I think that readers tend to think there's no contingency at Petersburg. That once the armies get there, there's a famous quote that everybody cites, and I'm not sure it was actually ever said because it was published after Lee died and couldn't refute it. But the quote goes something like, if the armies get across the James River, it will become a siege, and then it's just a mere question of time. And so that, with that kind of an overview, people are, a little less interested. We all know how it's going to turn out. And so let's go through, we'll talk about the crater, maybe we'll talk about Five Forks, and we'll get to Appomattox and we'll get over with this stuff. And sometimes teachers will, who are teaching the Civil War, will kind of gloss over Petersburg. My contention is that there was a great deal of contingency. And I feel like, the South, the Confederacy's goal was not to win the war. Confederacy's goal was to establish independence. They didn't have to win battles. They didn't have to conquer territory. All they had to do was outlast the North. And that was certainly possible. I would say the turning point in hindsight comes with Lincoln's reelection. That makes sure that the Northern war effort is going to continue until the Confederacy is subdued. Now, that's not to deny the interest in my last volume, because there's an awful lot of fighting that occurs. And a lot of and this is what we know. I say that's the turning point because we know it's the turning point. The people at the time didn't necessarily know that. And there's plenty of quotes from soldiers both North and South that would back that up. But the short answer is that that I think that the story of Petersburg has also been portrayed. It's often called a siege, and that's fine. People can call it a siege, but I don't call it a siege. To me, a siege requires two things. One, the enemy is entirely encircled, trapped. And secondly, formal siege operations, like what Grant conducted at Vicksburg, are undertaken. Neither of those factors were present at Petersburg. Lee obviously was never encircled, and Grant allowed Meade to undertake siege operations for precisely 1 day. And then he began these constant maneuvers that resulted in these massive battles with thousands of casualties. I'm rambling on you because you asked us a great question. I think another problem with Petersburg is that until recently, there hasn't been that much preserved at Petersburg. And I think that visitors, that Americans today equate significance with what they can see. And if it's gone and you can't see it anymore, it's sort of out of mind and it loses its cachet as an important event. And Petersburg had not been very well preserved until maybe starting in the 1990s, when more and more land outside of the national battlefield was being acquired. And now we have a pretty good critical mass, although there's still plenty that needs to be preserved around Petersburg. We still have a lot, there's a lot to see. And a visitor today can spend 3 days easily touring preserved sites around Petersburg. And I think that's going to add a little bit to its perception as significant.
Yeah, wow, fantastic answer. Now, you've mentioned a lot of the big names that we all know, Lee and Lincoln and Grant, but I was wondering, something I love is you tell a lot of the stories of the common soldier, and you do have moments of that in the book. Are there any that really stuck out to you, any of the sort of hidden figures who you felt were really important in the story?
Well, I think when you start looking at some of the subordinate commanders, the people that don't get that much attention, you start realizing there's some really great soldiers involved. William Mahone is somebody that doesn't get a lot of attention. The biography of William Mahone, who's a division commander in the Army of Northern Virginia, the last biography of him was written in 1931. So he's kind of out of sight, but I think Mahone stands out as an outstanding general. And there's all sorts. I mean, I don't know if there's any common soldiers in particular, but they all have a perspective, Gina, and I think their perspective is worth exploring. And I was delighted to be able to find so many letters from these fellows. You get the whole, you get people who are gung-ho, you get people who are just sick of the war, you get descriptions of how awful the Civil War was. I mean, I've been doing this, I'm 75 years old, I've been doing this since I was 20, and I just am appalled by the human cost of the Civil War. And I think hearing from soldiers who are in hospitals, reading soldiers' letters who are wounded and writing home and are about to die, brings home the tragedy of this war, of all wars, but the Civil War in particular, because it's all Americans fighting one another.
Right, and Walt Whitman writes so beautifully about that when he's nursing in the hospital.
Whenever I do a tour, I try at some point in the tour to remind the people on the tour that we're talking about human beings. You know, this book like mine, it goes into the strategy and the tactics and the troop movements, and that's all well and good. But we should never lose sight of the fact that these are all human beings. They all have mothers who care about them, wives who care about them, children who are waiting for them to come home. And these fellows from Mississippi or from Indiana, from Michigan or Louisiana who die 1,000 miles away from home in a place, and they're buried and are lost. Their identities are lost forever, and they rest in an unmarked grave at Poplar Grove National Cemetery. These are people that shouldn't be forgotten.
Absolutely. Now, we have so many teachers in our audience, and I think you've hit a little bit on how this book could be utilized, but if you had any other ideas about maybe how it could be excerpted in the classroom, I think people would really appreciate it.
Well, I tell you what, high school students might find this a little bit too dense for them. Gina, I don't know. I think you'd have to read between the lines. I've got a chapter that deals with the logistics of the Petersburg Campaign, the construction of the military railroad, the fortifications that were constructed by both sides, the trench raids, these not big battles, but 50 guys going over against a picket line to try to capture a few men to interrogate them. I think those might be stories that can be applied in a classroom.
Absolutely. And now, before I pass you over to Hannah, I know you have a connection to our founders, Dick Gilder and Lou Thurman. I was wondering if you could share that a little bit, because I think our
Well, thank you for asking that. Dick Gilder is one of my very best heroes. I met Dick back in, oh gosh, it must have been maybe 1986 or so, when he was in the habit of bringing his high school classmates on Civil War tours. And he called, I was working at Fredericksburg National Military Park at the time, and he called and said he wanted a guide for this bus group that he was bringing. And we're a little short-staffed, and we were not sure. He said, "Well, I'll pay $1,000." Oh, that got our attention. So I was selected to lead the tour, and from that point on, Dick and I struck up a good relationship. And in 1987, when a number of us, including Gary Gallagher, who you know well, decided that we needed to try to start an organization to preserve Civil War battlefields, I called Dick and asked him to come down and meet with our board to discuss what we should do. And he gave us some very sage advice, told us we were all thinking too small, that we needed to think bigger. And he was willing to underwrite a year of expense to fund an office. We were all volunteers up until then. And Dick continued to, and I became the director of an organization called the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, which is now the American Battlefield Trust. And Dick continued to provide not only financial support, but great advice to us. And I will always be grateful. Dick is one of the heroes of Civil War battlefield preservation, in my view.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, before I pass you over, just wanted to know what you hope readers take away upon finishing this book.
Well, I hope people will begin to understand that Petersburg deserves to be right up there with all the other Civil War engagements. I've just finished reading a letter from the son of a Confederate general who was killed at Petersburg, Archibald Gracie, who was writing in 1906.
And his son was on the Titanic.
His son was on the Titanic, exactly. And Gracie Mansion and all of that in New York. And he was writing a congressman in support of creating a battlefield park, a national park at Petersburg. And he said that it was the greatest military action of the war. And so if people read my volumes and they come away thinking, well, this was not only interesting, but really important, a great story, I think I'll be satisfied with that.
That's a fantastic answer. And we hope you'll join us when you write Volume 3 comes out. Hopefully.
May I live that long, yes.
Oh, hopefully next summer, right? It'll just be next summer.
Maybe a couple of years.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to pass you over to Hannah, who's going to start with our student scholar question of the week.
Great.
Right. Before I take any, oh, sorry.
Hi, Hannah. Just wanted to say hello.
So before I take any audience questions, I do want to focus our attention on the History Scholar of the Week. As Gina was saying, the History Scholar of the Week is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guests a question for a chance for themselves and their teacher to win a $50 gift card. So this week, our winning student was Markins from Union High School, who asked, in your research on the Petersburg Campaign from August to October 1864, what was the most surprising way in which the prolonged siege affected the morale, strategy, or daily life of soldiers on either side? And how did these months shape the eventual outcome of the war?
Well, that's a great question. That's a big question. And I think that this is a transition period from August to October, Hannah. I think at the beginning of August, morale was very high in the Confederate Army. There was great optimism, very little desertion, and the feeling that Grant, who had failed 3 previous times in the first 6 weeks of the campaign, was simply never going to be able to capture Petersburg and Richmond. On the Union side, the morale was low. The Battle of the Crater was a disaster. The first 2 offensives did not succeed, and they cost thousands and thousands of casualties. And the Union Army was having to resort to conscription and huge bounties in order to get fresh men to replace the 60,000 casualties that had occurred in the previous 2 months. By the end of this period, by the end of October, the script had flipped. Confederates were beginning to be pessimistic. Yes, they had kept Grant out of Petersburg and Richmond again for 3 different major offensives. They had succeeded. But every time Grant would extend his lines farther and farther. And unlike the Union Army, who was getting new recruits, albeit draftees sometimes and bounty men, the Confederate manpower was tapped out. And so as the Confederates were spreading out farther and farther along their defense lines, they were getting thinner and thinner. And another factor that was beginning to bite was a lack of supplies for the Confederates. Confederates were relying on railroads. All but one railroad leading to Richmond had to come through Petersburg. And by the end of October, there was only one of those railroads still functioning to bring in supplies. Whereas on the Union side, General Grant had created a supply depot at City Point with the confluence of the Appomattox and James Rivers that was the largest port in North America at the time, bigger than New York City. And so he built a railroad that went right behind the Union lines, so bread that was baked at City Point would be put on a train and delivered to the soldiers still warm. And the Confederates were getting some pretty poor rations at that time. So morale was, it hadn't completely gone south yet, but morale in the Confederate Army was diminishing, while morale in the Union Army was beginning to rise.
Thank you so much for that answer. And again, thank you to Markins for that amazing question. So kind of speaking of this change in morale on either side, we also have a lot of questions on newspapers at the time. So Richard asks, how was the longest running battle reported, especially in the North? Did stories about its relatively slow progress and the disappointment at the crater cast a shadow over Lincoln's electoral prospects? And then similarly, Bess also asked if there's any specific newspapers that reported on the battle that you would recommend as primary sources.
Well, that's another wonderful question. And newspapers in the 19th century were a little bit different than newspapers today, not entirely, but they were very much partisan. The editorials in the newspapers, they were clearly Democrat, and I'm talking about newspapers in the North now, Democrat newspapers and Republican newspapers. And so the way that the news of the battlefield was reported had a great deal to do with the editorial bent of the newspaper. There were New York newspapers that were very much anti-Lincoln and would be reporting events on the battlefield in a negative way. And there were newspapers that were very pro-Lincoln, pro-Union Army in New York and Philadelphia. New York Times, the New York World, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe. And there were newspapers all over the North. And because Petersburg was occurring in the Eastern Theater, this is where the reporters, they were called correspondents in the 19th century. This is where the correspondents were embedded, to use a 21st century term. And so the events at Petersburg and Richmond got an awful lot of attention. Now, in the South, there tended to be more of a cheerleading bent with Southern newspapers. Defeats were downplayed in Southern newspapers, and victories were celebrated in Southern newspapers. Now in Richmond, there were a number of different newspapers, and I think the divide in the Richmond newspapers and in other newspapers in the South as well was between pro-Jefferson Davis editors and anti-Jefferson Davis editors. And so there were plenty of opportunities for these editors to put their own spin on what was happening. You know, the Confederacy didn't have political parties per se. The North certainly did. Republicans and Democrats certainly had a different viewpoint of the war. Many of the Democrats did. In the South, there were no political parties. There was sort of a pro-Jefferson Davis bent and an anti-Jefferson Davis bent. And the papers would sometimes reflect those views. But more often than not, Southern newspapers tended to be on the positive side in order to gin up support for the war and the home front. We talked earlier, Hannah, about morale in the Confederate Army. Morale behind the lines in the Confederacy tended to deteriorate faster than it did in the Army. You know, and that's a story that it needs to be told as well. And many historians have written about the home front in the Civil War. If you're a woman whose husband is in the Army and probably hasn't been paid for 6-8 months and is trying to raise children by herself and maintain the farm at home, things are really pretty tough for her. And she is much more inclined to wish that her husband was home and the war was over, while the husband might be thinking, while I miss you, my duty is at the front. So there was that dynamic as well.
So actually, speaking of women, we have another question from Bess that asks if you found anything about the women who followed the troops.
Well, there were a number of women that were with the armies. There were a few, and I document some of them in the book. There were a few that actually masqueraded as men and served as soldiers. There's a book out that claims that some 500 women became soldiers during the Civil War. That number might be a little bit high, but there certainly was a presence of women in the ranks. In fact, a couple of women actually revealed themselves by giving birth while they were in the Army masquerading as soldiers. And one Union wag said that we're bound to win because we can just create soldiers right here on the battlefield. But more often, women's presence were as laundresses, sometimes nursing assistants in hospitals. Oftentimes, enlisted men's wives would join the Army, not officially, but would become laundresses to the troops and get a certain amount of pay. And they did that not only for the money, but also to be with their families. There were also lots of nurses Now, women like Clara Barton helped overcome this bias against women in hospitals. 19th century Victorians were very squeamish about the idea of a woman being exposed to a man in a hospital bed. He might be unclothed. And Clara Barton overcame that, and other women who were in hospitals overcame that. In the South, in Richmond, there were a number of women who actually ran a hospital. There was a woman named Phoebe Pember, who was actually commissioned as a captain in the Confederate Army, as she ran one of the largest hospitals in Richmond. And there were also prostitutes that were around the Army. There was a whole street full of prostitutes at City Point, the Union Logistical Center, that were managed by the Army. They were given health inspections. Their pay was dictated by the Army. And in Richmond and large cities in Petersburg as well, there were also prostitutes. But the women did play an important role with both armies. That's an excellent question.
So interesting. Kind of continuing on this aspect of diversity, we have a question from Homer who asks if any of the stories of the bravery of Black soldiers stood out to you, or if there's any specific person that you were able to find a lot of documents about.
Well, there was a battle in September of 1864 on the north side of the James River called the Battle of Newmarket Heights. And in this case, Black units from the Army of the James made an attack against an entrenched Confederate position and actually carried that position heroically. It lost a tremendous number of casualties in the process. And there were 14 Black men, Black soldiers, who received the Medal of Honor as a result of this attack. A man named Fleetwood was one of the most important of those troops. There was a soldier who fought on that same day. It was the same day, September 29th. A fellow who was known to history as Corporal Dick. And Corporal Dick was attacking a Confederate fort known as Fort Gilmer. And he was in the forefront of this assault. Fort Gilmer had a big, deep moat in front of it and a big, steep bank. And this man, Corporal Dick, who was admired by all of his comrades, actually got up onto the parapet of that fort where he was killed. And he was somebody that was celebrated by those troops for the rest of the war. So there were a number of Black soldiers who played a significant role in the fighting at Petersburg and Richmond, including those 14 men who earned the Medal of Honor.
That's so interesting. We have so many good questions. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk about battlefield preservation, specifically with this specific battle. So Addie asks, can you advise us as to the present and possible future of preservation at Petersburg?
Well, boy, these questions are wonderful. Sure, I'll go into that a little bit. Of course, the flagship preservation organization at Petersburg is the National Park Service. There's a unit of the Park Service called Petersburg National Battlefield. It was established in 1926 and has grown over the years to where they preserve several thousand of acres of battlefield land, including the fighting at the Crater, the fighting at Battery 5, at Fort Stedman, and out at Five Forks, which was acquired in the early 1990s. So the National Park Service has a headquarters at Petersburg. They also have a unit at City Point, where they talk about the logistical operation from an antebellum home there called Appomattox Manor. But in addition to the National Park Service, there have been a number of acquisitions. within the last 30 years or so. The Conservation Fund acquired a large tract of land at a place called Greene Station, which is about 8 miles south of Petersburg, the site of two battles, one in June and one in August of 1864. Supplementing what the Conservation Fund did there, the American Battlefield Trust has now taken up the cause, and they have done tremendous work at the Petersburg Campaign. They bought land at Greene Station. They bought a great deal of land at a place called Hatcher's Run, where there was a battle on October 27th, and also fighting from February 5th through the 7th of 1865. They just acquired some land that deals with the attack on June 22nd and on August 19th. There's a place now that is interpreted that you can learn about those fights. They've acquired land at a place called White Oak Road, a battlefield that occurred on March 31st, 1865. And I think one of the greatest things they've done is they've acquired the battlefield of People's Farm, or Peagram's Farm, that took place on September the 30th, 1864. That is really a unique situation, Hannah, because three entities preserve this tract of land. The National Park Service bought strips of land where the earthworks were located, including this stretch of land where a place called Fort Welch has been preserved since the 1930s. Organization that I was involved with for a number of years, called Pamplin Historical Park, acquired about 440 acres of a battlefield that took place on April the 2nd, 1865, really the decisive battle at Petersburg. That's a very well-interpreted place. It's privately run, and it has 4 museums and a number of historic houses, and it owns the Confederate line. But the land in between was privately owned, and that land was acquired by the American Battlefield Trust. So today, you can start at the National Park Service land at Fort Welch, walk across American Battlefield Trust land with interpretive signs, and then come into Pamplin Historical Park and finish the story. So there has been a great deal of preservation done, but still there's a lot left to do. And the American Battlefield Trust is doing a terrific job of that, as well as the National Park Service. So Petersburg now is a great place to visit, whereas maybe 30 years ago, you could drive the tour road at the battlefield for an hour and a half, and that would be pretty much it. Today, it's an entirely different story.
So with the hundreds of acres that are already preserved and more to be preserved in the future, as you were saying before, a lot of K through 12 teachers attend this program. So Bob would like to know, what places in and around Petersburg would you suggest middle and high school students and teachers visit that tell the story visually of the battle if they're able to take a day trip there today?
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you the National Park Service has a good education program. But I'm a little bit biased because I was the director at Pamplin Historical Park for how many years was it? I guess 25 or something. And we developed an excellent student education program at Pamplin Historical Park. And we have a curriculum there that is designed for 5th graders and high school students. And there's also a unique opportunity at Petersburg, at Pamplin Historical Park. It's called the Civil War Adventure Camp. And a student group can sign up and live the life of a Confederate soldier or a Union soldier, depending on which they prefer, from about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on day 1 till 11 o'clock the next morning on day 2, including sleeping overnight in soldier huts, demonstrating how Civil War weapons were fired, demonstrating camp life, eating a meal like a Civil War soldier would have, although I got to say that the food's a little bit better than a Civil War soldier would have had.
Hopefully.
But it's not McDonald's and it's not Burger King. And that is a wonderful opportunity. People can sign up for that. A group can sign up for that. And just kind of contacting Pamplin Historical Park, you can learn how to do that.
And I know you might be a little bit biased considering you did work there, but is there any specific part of the battlefield that, whether you worked on it or not, is really special to you or really interesting that you think people should pay more attention to?
Well, again, I think at Pamplin Historical Park, we developed a series of trails. And I think, we give guided tours of those trails that deal with the fighting that occurred on April 2nd, 1865, which is the terminus of the Petersburg Campaign. The next day, Richmond and Petersburg fall. The Confederate earthworks there are spectacular. They're as high as a man's head still. And I think that kids can get a real, there's no substitute for being at the place where historic things happen. There's a magic that occurs when you're standing on the same ground that 160 years ago was contested by Americans from both sides. And that feeling can occur on any battlefield, I think. And if it's properly presented, it affects you for the rest of your life. That's how I got interested in the Civil War. My parents took me to Gettysburg when I was in the 5th grade. And I was just mesmerized by seeing the battlefield and all the monuments and hearing the stories. And we don't try to, I don't think the National Park Service or the American Battlefield Trust, which does a good job with interpretation, or Pamplin Historical Park expects the people that visit to become historians in their career, but they can, we do hope that it transforms people into becoming lifelong preservers of historic places. We have to reach out. I'm so glad that this program deals with so many teachers and students because they're the future. These places only exist if people continue to believe that they're important. If they're not important, they will not exist. And so young people are critical in becoming the future of historic preservation, of people who want to preserve that historic house in their community, or contribute a few dollars to a preservation project someplace, not just battlefields, but any kind of history. And so I would encourage teachers, parents, grandparents to take those young people to these historic places, expose them to these magical spots where important events occurred. And hopefully that will turn them into lifelong proponents of preserving history.
That is an amazing way to put it. I know as a history student myself and many other people in the discipline, it's always one preservation project or one document that really just draws you in. So amazing way to put it. Again, we have so many amazing questions today, but I wanted to choose one to kind of like sum everything up, to kind of wrap everything up. So, what lesson from this period in history do you think is most important for students today to know?
Wow. What lesson is most important? I think that soldiers on both sides, and I'm just talking about my book, which is military history primarily, that soldiers on both sides believed in a cause. Now today we look at the Confederate cause and we think, well, my gosh, it perpetuated slavery, and so it was a cause that we don't support anymore. But I think believing in something that is important to you and that's bigger than you is a critical lesson. If we're all just selfish and are only looking out for what's best for us, we never look beyond our own noses, doesn't make us very good citizens, right? And I think when you study these Civil War soldiers and you read their letters and their dedication to their cause, irrespective of what that cause was, it gives us some inspiration and it gives us a roadmap to how to live our own lives, to believe in something bigger than yourself, to be willing to sacrifice. Ask yourself, everybody should ask yourself, what would I die for? What would I put my life on the line for? And for the Civil War soldier, they put their lives on the line for a cause that I'm getting a message here that can you hear me, Hannah? Okay. I'm getting a
Yep,
message that
okay.
my audio is not good.
Oh.
That, what is it that is bigger than you? And these fellows were willing to go off, join an army and fight for a cause, and die for a cause. I mean, at Petersburg, my gosh, there were more than 70,000 Americans who were killed, wounded, or captured at Petersburg. And that's in a country that's 1/10 the size of our country today. If that was to happen today, that would be 700,000 Americans who would never come home again the same as they left or come home at all for a cause they believed in. So I would challenge everyone to read history and ask yourself, what is it that I believe in? What is it that's important to me that I would give my life for? And hopefully that would make all of us better citizens.
And thank you so much, both for this past question and for the entire Q&A. And Gina, you ready to take over?
Yes, thank you so much. That was an amazing back and forth. I loved listening to the fantastic audience questions. And something we always like to say, if you didn't get a chance to have your question answered, a great remedy for that is to purchase a copy of the book. And you can do it today at bookshop.org. And the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And next week, we hope you'll join us for another Civil War figure, or pre-Civil War, Charles Sumner, Conscience of a Nation, which is a fantastic book, and we hope you'll join us for. And you can watch this and an archive of more than 250 scholar presentations of book breaks at gilderlerman.org/book breaks. You can also visit our website for historical documents, History Now, online exhibitions, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Will, it was such a pleasure talking to you today. This was just so much fun, and we can't wait to have you back for book 3.
Well, I wish you were my history teacher in high school. I would have been even better historian. You're wonderful, Gina. And thank you, Hannah, for your great questions.
All right, everybody. Well, have a great day and have a great rest of the summer, everyone.